turn in your Bibles this evening, we're going to be in Genesis chapter 12, verses 10 to 20 to begin with. We're discussing more reasons that people give for why they believe that there are Bible discrepancies. And last week we talked about the hour that Jesus died. Was it the third hour, the sixth hour? We talked about how long was Jesus in the tomb. Was it really 3 days and 3 nights? And we discussed how units of money can sometimes yield different results with biblical and non-biblical sources, only to realize that exchange rates, just like they do today, existed then too. And that was not a reason to disbelieve the Bible. Another reason some people give as to why they can't believe the Bible is true or that there are discrepancies in the Bible is the use of what the author talks about are doublets. And basically what we're talking about here is a very similar story told at different points in the book. Or among maybe the Gospels, how we might have the same thing mentioned, and we're not talking about a harmonization problem. We're talking about, it was a different situation, and really is that, can we trust what the Gospel writers gave us? So we're going to start with Abraham. Let's read Genesis chapter 12, verses 10 to 20. We'll start with Naomi. We'll do 3 verses each, 10 through 20.
Now there was a famine in the land, so Abram went down to Egypt and sojourned there, for the famine was severe in the land. When he was about to enter Egypt, he said to Sarah his wife, I know that you are a woman beautiful in appearance, and when the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife. Then they will kill me, but they will let you live.
They say, you are my sister, that it may be well with me for your sake, and that I may live because of you. So it was when Abram came to Egypt, that the Egyptians saw the woman, that she was very beautiful. The princes of Pharaoh also saw her and commended her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken to Pharaoh's house.
He treated Abram well for her sake. He had sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male and female servants, female donkeys and camels. But the Lord plagued Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarah, Abram's wife. The Pharaoh called Abram and said, what is this you have done to me? Why did you not tell me she was your wife?
Why did you say, she is my sister? I might have taken her as my wife. Now, therefore, here is your wife. Take her and go your way. So Pharaoh commanded his men concerning him, and they sent him away with his wife and all that he had.
Okay, so I'd like us to get some key points here. Why did Abraham go to Egypt? All right, so Abram was in Canaan. There was a famine there, and he went down to Egypt. We see this story a lot too. There were famines in Canaan, what would be Israel. Egypt at the time was a place, a very powerful nation, had food. Abram went there. All right, what did he tell Sarah to tell Pharaoh? Okay. Now, we don't get that in this story, but was Sarah Abram's sister? Half-sister. Yeah. Had the same father, different mother. Not a stepsister. Stepsister is when two people marry, they already had children. And you become, the children aren't necessarily related. But they are through their parents' marriage, brothers and sisters, stepbrothers, stepsisters, whereas a half-brother or half-sister is one that has one parent is the same to both, whereas the other parent is not. And so Sarah is Abram's half-sister. What was the problem when it came to Abram and Pharaoh.
Well, we misled him. He almost, Pharaoh said, I almost, or what if I had taken her as my wife?
So he misled him. How did he do that? What did he forget to tell Pharaoh? Yeah, part that they were married. What makes this a lie is that Abram kept back part of the truth that Pharaoh needed to know. It was not a full-out blown lie. It was what we would call a half-truth. But a half-truth is still a lie. There are some times where it is not a lie to keep back parts of information that others don't need to know. Lawyers will tell you this. Don't answer the question that's not asked. If a lawyer tells you, do you know what time it is? You say it's 1 o'clock, they're going to say you answered what was not asked. The question was, do you know what time it is? It's either yes or no. If you know the time, if someone wants to ask you what time it is, they will ask you what time it is. Keeping back a part of a thing that someone doesn't need to know is not a lie. If we go to court and we're said, we want you to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, they aren't just being repetitive there. They want you not to lie, not to half lie, and not to tell anything but the truth, not to scatter lies within the truth. They're not just being redundant in how they say it, because people will say, well, what I said was the truth. It wasn't the whole truth. And you scattered lies in there, so it was nothing but the truth. It was something other than the truth. There might have been truth and lies mixed in there. Abram had to tell Pharaoh she was his wife if Pharaoh was wanting to take her as a wife. That's why Abram lied. Abram lied out of fear. He was afraid that Pharaoh would kill him and take her as his wife anyway. And so Abram lied out of fear. That is one of the reasons we lie. We lie because we are afraid of something that will happen if we don't. But Pharaoh was angry with that, and rightfully so. All right, we have this story. And if that was the only story, people might say, okay, Abram lied. But then we go to Genesis 20. And we still are dealing with Abraham. This is before Sarah's pregnant with Isaac. Let's read the first 13 verses. We'll start with Naomi. We'll still do 3 verses each. Okay, we'll start with Tammy then. Verses 1 to 13.
And Abraham journeyed from there to the south, dwelt between Kadesh and Shur, and stayed in Gerar. Now Abraham said of Sarai his wife, she is my sister. And Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. And God came to Abimelech in a dream by night and said to him, indeed, you are a dead man because of the woman whom you have taken, for she's a man's wife.
But Abimelech had not come to hear her. And he said, Lord, will you slay a righteous nation also? Did he not say to me, she is my sister? And she, even she herself, said, he is my brother. In the integrity of my heart and innocence of my hands, I have done this. And God said to him in the dream, yes, I know that you did this in the integrity of your heart, but I also withheld you from sinning against me. Therefore, I did not let you touch it.
Now therefore restore a man's wife, for he is a prophet, and he will pray for you, and you shall live. But if you do not restore her, know that you shall surely die, you and all who are yours. So Abimelech rose early in the morning, called all his servants, and told all these things in their hearing, and the men were very much afraid. And Abimelech called Abraham and said to him, what have you done to us? How have I offended you, that you have brought on me and on my kingdom a great sin? You have done this to me and ought not to be done.
And Abimelech said to Abraham, "What did you see that you did this thing?" Abraham said, "I did it because I thought, there is no fear of God at all in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife. Besides, she is indeed my sister, the daughter of my father, though not the daughter of my mother, and she became my wife."
And it came to pass, when God caused me to wander from my father's house, that I said to her, This is your kindness that you should do for me. In every place wherever we go, say of me, He's my brother.
Okay. People say, see? Same story. Abraham was reproved in Egypt. Why would he do it again? Got to be the same story. How can we trust the Bible when it's going to tell us stories that are the same? What's the problem with that reasoning?
It's not the same story.
Well, if it's not the same story, what are the differences?
King.
All right, so it's different king. All right, it's different circumstances, different king, different setting. How did God appear to Pharaoh? How did God stop Pharaoh from sinning? In Genesis chapter 12. It's down around verse 18.
He played Pharaoh in his house.
Ah, how did he come to Abimelech?
In a dream.
In a dream while he was sleeping. And both men didn't know that they were taking a man's wife. Abimelech even says, I did this with integrity of heart. And God says, I know you did. And that's why I kept you from sinning. I know you did. I find it interesting here. Why did Abraham was not able to inherit the promised land? Because the sins of the Amorites were not yet full. Abimelech was one of the kings of that land. And he still knew who God was and respected God's laws. Or at least some of them anyway. Now Abraham thought that he didn't. He was afraid again. But we find here in verse 13 that this was a habit that Abraham did. And so since we find it as a habit, we shouldn't be surprised it happened twice. We shouldn't be surprised at that at all. And so we might be able to accept, okay, Abraham did it twice. But then we come to his son. Let's go to Genesis 26. Genesis 26. Oh, by the way, Genesis 20 was where we found out that Abraham and Sarah were brother and sister, half brother, half sister, but also married. Genesis 26, verses 7 to 11. And we'll go back to Bill. We'll do 2 verses each this time.
And the men of the place, so Isaac brought Gerar. The men of the place asked about his wife. And he said, She is my sister. For he was afraid to say, She is my wife. Because he thought, Lest the men of the place kill me through Rebekah, because she is beautiful to behold. Now it came to pass when he had been there a long time, that Abimelech, king of the Philistines, looked through the window and saw, and there was Isaac showing endearment to Rebekah his wife.
Then Abimelech called Isaac and said, Find obviously she is your wife. So how could you say she is my sister? Isaac said to him, Because I said, Lest I die on account of it. And Abimelech said, What is this you have done to us? All the people might soon have lain with your wife, and you would have brought guilt on us. So Abimelech charged all his people, saying, he who touched this man or his wife shall surely be put to death.
Okay. If I was going to make a charge against the Bible on a doublet, I wouldn't use Abraham's result with Pharaoh and Abimelech. I would use Abraham and Isaac's encounters. Because Isaac here, in chapter 26, probably is around 70 years old. Because Jacob and Esau are already born. We know that Jacob and Esau were born when Isaac was 60, because Isaac wasn't married till he was 40, and Rebekah couldn't conceive for quite a long time. Scriptures are very clear. Isaac is 60 when Jacob and Esau are born. So he's older than that. Rebekah probably was quite younger than Isaac. Rebekah probably could be in her 40s here. Could be as much as 20 years younger than Isaac. And so if Isaac's over 60, she's in her 40s somewhere. So it's not exactly like Sarah, who we come along and say, well, she was old, being in her 70s and 80s and 90s when the encounters with the Philistines. Rebekah's a lot younger than that. And so we might come along and say, okay, I see it. But we have Abimelech in both stories. In fact, I think you'll find Phicol, who's Abimelech's commander, is in both stories. Now, could it be the same Abimelech? It could be the same Abimelech. However, what else could happen? What else could it be? Could be another Abimelech. Ramses in Egypt. There's Ramses the first, Ramses the second. We have how many King Georges? There are 6 of them in England. Some of them actually were named George, and some of them were named or took on the name George when they became king. But there are 6 of them. Charles, the current king, there are 3 of them. Elizabeth, there were 2 of them. Like, as far as we understand, kings can have the same name. Plus, there is some evidence that Abimelech was actually not the name of the king, but a title, like Pharaoh. When we read of Pharaoh in Egypt, we recognize it's not the same man. That's his title. The reason why people might come to that conclusion is because his commander is named Phicol as well. And that seemed to be the title of the commander. And so that's answerable. Could be the same Abimelech, could be a different Abimelech. It could be the title of the king, and therefore a different person altogether that we don't know their name. The story sounds very similar. Only difference is we'll discuss 2 possibilities. But I take one stand, and I know some others take another, but that's fine. Was Rebekah Isaac's sister? What was she? She wasn't. What was she? But no. Besides being his wife. She wasn't. Abraham and Sarah, technically it's a half-truth. They were half-brother, half-sister. Was Rebekah Isaac's sister in any sense of the way we use sister? No. What was she? Cousin. Yeah, she was cousin. Because you have Nahor, Abraham's brother, had 2 children, Laban and Rebekah. We'll find Laban later on in Jacob's story. Rachel and Jacob, same type of relation. Cousins. Now, we would think today that would be pretty bad. In that day and age, those types of marriages were acceptable. And they're not today, or well, I can't say they're not today, because in some places you can still marry your first cousin. I find that quite weird, but it is not banned. I don't think it's banned in Ontario either. if I remember the rules for who can marry in Ontario. And I don't think first cousins banned, but I could be wrong on that. She was a cousin. So in that sense, this was even worse than Abraham and Sarah, and she wasn't his sister. Now, I know some will come along and say, well, brother and sister was a more loosely held term in the Hebrews, and that's true. Son didn't necessarily mean direct son. It could have been grandson. Brother didn't necessarily mean brother. It could be another relative, and that's true. But I don't believe that's how it was being used here. I believe Isaac was, meaning she was his sister in the sense that they were brother and sister. And it's a very similar story. And so why would Isaac do the same thing as Abraham? Certainly this is the Bible just telling us a new story. And that's not necessarily true. We sometimes say like father, like son. And if you take my view on how Genesis was compiled as traditions, you'd realize why Isaac, it would make very much sense why Isaac copied his father, in that this section of Genesis was written by Isaac. Like as far as these were stories from Isaac, going all the way back to Genesis chapter 12. Isaac is actually the narrator for a lot of that. Abraham would have provided Isaac those stories, but Isaac is the one who narrated this section of the story. And it was later compiled by Moses. And so if Isaac knew of what his father did, and it was the same type of culture, it makes sense why Isaac did what he did. But just because we see the same story doesn't mean that somehow the Bible's lying to us, or that there's a contradiction someplace. Those who fail to learn from history, what's the saying? Are doomed to repeat it. History repeats itself. So Moses striking the rock and speaking to the rock. Two different stories. One came with punishment, one did not. The angel coming to Joseph and then coming to Mary. Well, there are two different people in two different places at two different times. The angel came to Mary before he came to Joseph. The angel came to Joseph after Mary was pregnant. The angel came to Mary before she was pregnant. Not the same story. What is called the Lord's Prayer in Matthew chapter 6 and Luke chapter 6. Matthew chapter 5 is where the Lord's Prayer is, and Luke chapter 6. Naomi can attest this because she's gone with me on trips where I've preached. Do preachers preach the same sermons in different times in different places? Yes. In fact, when I go visiting, I rarely make a new sermon unless it's for a church that supports me. But even then, I don't always make a new sermon. It's very rare I do, because the sermon is if it's a good sermon, I don't have the audience that I have, with the exception of Naomi, has never heard it before. I've never repeated a sermon here, but I've only been here 9 years. If my audience was different, if I'm still here 15 years, 20 years, and my audience is largely different than it was before, might I preach the same sermon? Sure. And if there was a few people in the audience who had heard it before, chances are they wouldn't remember it. Or at least that specific sermon. They might remember the story because it's a similar thing. Preachers do that. So that Jesus preached the same sermon at two different times, one on a plain, one on a mountain, doesn't disprove the Bible at all. Feeding of the 5,000, feeding of the 4,000 was two different occasions. That these are not reasons to give up faith in the Bible. They're just not. And they're not discrepancies either. It's not just that the authors wanted to fill pages. there usually is a purpose of telling the story again, as far as for duplicating not the story itself, but why you told two different types of a very similar story. Usually, first of all, Matthew and Luke weren't written by the same author. So you can't come along and say that, oh, well, the Sermon on the Mount, well, one was written by Matthew, one was written by Luke. Feeding of the 5,000, feeding the 4,000 are two events that occur in two chapters, consecutive chapters. Do you really think the people who read Matthew wouldn't know that, oh, Matthew repeated himself here? Of course, they didn't have chapters and verses. It was the next paragraph. And so these are people, again, if they're going to disbelieve the Bible, they're going to find a reason to do it. And this is a pretty weak reason. Do you have something, Bill?
Yeah, I'm surprised that someone would even try to discredit the Bible over Abraham and Isaac. I mean, it's common knowledge with men that they're very good, beautiful wife. They usually feel insecure.
Yeah.
And they're paranoid of those things. And so maybe in those days, maybe not now, they would kill you or grab your wife, but maybe back then. So, I mean, the idea of Isaac using the same lie, that shouldn't surprise us either, because it's worked for someone else.
Yeah.
We've already seen it.
Yeah. And like Isaac wasn't alive for those first two stories, but like I said, that hasn't stopped anyone else. It obviously was a probably common thing to do. It probably was pretty common. We read of it in the scriptures and say, well, that's very strange. Yeah, by 21st century culture, yeah, it's very strange. But I don't believe you're going to find it was that strange when you're dealing with men in power. Men in power get what they want, usually. If they wield power, they will wield it corruptly. If they are corrupt, they will take things that are not there, and they will be above the law in societies that don't hold the rich and powerful accountable. Why is it that it seems like there's a justice system for the rich and a justice system for everyone else? Because society on the whole will not hold rich and powerful people to the same standard. Rich and powerful people can do a lot of things that we can't. Some will get held accountable, but that is the exception more often than it is the rule. People with money and power use their money and power to get what they want. Why is it that sometimes we come along and someone who is bankrupt, someone who is rich and powerful that is bankrupt, don't become poor by going bankrupt? They still get to keep a lot of their money, yet when a poor person goes bankrupt, they squeeze every dime out of you that you have. It's because rich and powerful people are generally not treated the same. And so, that again, yeah, you're right. It's not a reason. It's a pretty weak reason. But I've heard some people try to discredit the Bible for, oh, it repeats stories. These things must not really have happened. This must be myth. No, these things really did happen. And when we take a look at society, we come along and one premier does one thing, and the next premier comes in, and we find that they do the exact same thing. And they say, well, why did they do that? Did they not learn from the other guy? No, they didn't. They just didn't. Mankind will never learn. We do the same things over and over again. Another reason why people think that they can discredit the Bible is because they believe when the Bible speaks about certain things, and it speaks, and what it sounds like is so exact, not realizing that the Bible is speaking in generalizations. That not everything is 100% true all of the time, but you can know that from reading what the passage talks about. And that's especially true in the book of Proverbs. Who read last? Anyone remember who read last? We'll start with Naomi then. Proverbs chapter 22, verse 6. Tammy, you want to get Proverbs 22:15, and Bill can get Ephesians 6, verse 4. Proverbs 22, verse 6.
Train up a child in the way he should go, even when he is old, he will not depart from it.
What's the verse mean? What's it talking about? Okay. This verse is talking about raising your child. What's the goal, according to the writer of Proverbs here? To train your child in the way he should go. What's the goal?
Speak of righteousness.
Yeah. So
They'll grow up and do that.
they'll grow up and do that. That's the goal of raising children. Even ungodly people will raise their children, at the very least, to be members of society that at least you could get along with society. May not be walk in the ways of God, but a lot of parents don't have children saying, I'm going to raise a criminal. I'm going to raise a murderer. I'm going to raise whatever. No, even people in the world recognize, okay, there's something I should be doing to raise my children to be at least honorable members of society. People who could get a job, keep a job, get a family, be respectful. Some parents fail miserably at that. But it's not true of everyone. Even an ungodly parent can raise a child that's at least not a criminal. May not be righteous, but at least they're not a criminal. Is it always true that if a person is raised to know God and raised by a family that follows God and actually does, they're not hypocrites, that their children will be guaranteed to be righteous before God? No. Well then, how does this verse say, raise a child in the way he should go, and when he is old he will not depart from it? What is this verse speaking in?
Sometimes when we get older, we learn, see mistakes of others, we learn from our own mistakes. But if you don't teach them when they get old, they come to any common sense, how are they going to resort back to something that they never taught?
Yeah. This verse is speaking generally. We often will speak in generalizations too. We have proverbs that we say that we recognize, okay, generally speaking, that's true. It's not always 100% true, but generally speaking, that's true. A person who raises their children to know God, lives the life of a Christian, shows their children what it means to be a Christian, that exposure oftentimes will lead to the child becoming a Christian. They'll know what sin is. They'll know to abhor sin. They will know how to become a Christian. And generally speaking, if they have their own faith, will remain a Christian. We see that. Isaac and Jacob. Now, Jacob had a lot of problems in his life, but he at least had a faithful father. And when he was older, as Bill said earlier, he had faith to lean back on. When you take a look at David's sons, David had some weaknesses in raising family. And he had Amnon, who raped his sister, Absalom, who killed his brother, and Adonijah, who wanted to steal the throne upon David's death. He had some problems. He had multiple wives, which led to those problems. He sinned with Bathsheba, that led to a a compromised character. And so we can see the difference between being raised in a godly family and having parents that instill that. And even in David, who was a faithful man, but I believe in some regards was a poor parent in raising his children. Now, it's not always true that you could be the best of parents and your children still wind up being ungodly. As I said, it's not always true. And you could be a pretty bad parent whose children become Christians. It can happen both ways, but generally speaking, you want your child to be a Christian, raise them that way. You have a much better chance of that happening. Proverbs 22, verse 15.
Foolishness is bound up in the heart of the child. The rod of correction will drive it far from him.
Okay. Discipline often will lead to correction. Children, if you let them run your house, will run you crazy. Because children aren't mature enough to run the house. I've always marveled at parents who give their children choice. What do you want to have for dinner? I'm talking about like children Nasa. What do you want to have for dinner? It's one thing to say, would you like this or this? All right, that's a choice a child can make. You've made the decision that we can have this or this. This is both things that you say, okay, those are acceptable for my child to eat, and you give them that choice. But to have the child dictate what's for dinner at the age of 5 or 6, the child's not ready to make that choice yet. We give children more responsibility as they get old. We don't allow small children to rule the family. But if we want our children to grow up to be disciplined people, we have to discipline. So the rate of success is extremely high when parents follow the guidelines of Proverbs, but they aren't 100% true, and they're not presented that way. They are presented as maxims for godly living. If you do this, high likelihood this will happen. Henry, you want to get Ephesians 6, verse 4.
And you, fathers, not provoking children to wrath, but raising up in training by the admonition of the Lord.
That's a father's responsibility. Don't provoke your children to wrath. Bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. If you do that, chances are they will become Christians. If you don't, chances are they won't. The rest is up to the child. The child has to make their own decisions when they get old enough to make those decisions. But if a parent does those things, they live by those things, the child will see that and typically follow on. But the book of Proverbs isn't giving us promises. They're giving us wisdom. It is a book of wisdom. This is what, if you are wise, you will do. And if you are wise and do these things, this is likely to be the outcome. Wear your seatbelt is a wise thing. Why? Because if you get into a car crash, you won't die. Well, if I said it like that and someone died while wearing their seatbelt, you say, well, that's not 100% true. I was speaking in a generalization. Your chances of living are greater in a car accident if you're not dying if you're wearing your seatbelt. But if we go fast enough or hit something hard enough, seatbelt may not even protect us. But we make those generalizations all the time. That's not a contradiction either. Because we're dealing with a set of scriptures that are wisdom scriptures. And if we recognize the genre of scriptures like we've done in the past, gone through that, if we recognize, okay, this is not God telling us, this is what 100%, this is wisdom. This is what a wise person would do. This is what will likely happen if you are wise. Then we don't run into those silly types of problems. I'm not ashamed to